going back to the topic of inflation, the problem is that it's a very complex answer.
Right.
And what a lot of people do is they pick a subset and a narrative and they kind of just focus on that. Whereas it's one of those things where the answer to that question is inflation, how does it affect wealth concentration, is actually kind of it's you need like a multiple paragraph answer to answer that question. And so just take a step back, hyperinflation is like always bad, right? So when a currency breaks, almost 99% of people have trouble. Businesses can't function when there's no pricing mechanism, and it's just bad for everyone. And even these like near like things that aren't technically hyperinflations, but just like horrible inflations that you see throughout emerging markets, where savings just get erased every generation or so, or cut in half. Those are terrible, and people should have a way to defend against that. That's like the work of Alex Gladstein, from the Human Rights Foundation, talks about Bitcoin usage in emerging markets. How a lot of these people, they just don't, they don't have access to stocks. They're stuck in their local currency, and their currency gets devalued, and they just have to start all over. Whereas, something like Bitcoin is a tool that they have now that basically kind of think gives them back some of that power. So there's that, set of scenarios. If we look back and say United States history, if you look at the 1940s, the 1970s, inflationary decades, you actually had a partial reduction in wealth concentration during those decades, as measured by, say, the share of wealth owned by the top 0.1% or the top 1%, however you want to define it. You had a contraction in wealth concentration, and those partially related to the policies that were happening. So in the 70s, you had very strong wage growth, and you had equities perform very poorly. So the wealthy generally didn't their assets didn't do great while workers had their wages go up. It was a very unionized environment, very kind of pro labor still, kind of the tail end of that. Um, and then you also, if a middle class person had a home with a fixed rate mortgage, uh, that did very well financially. In the 40s, again, you had an inflationary environment. It was obviously a war. It was obviously terrible for a lot of people. But kind of the during and the aftermath of it, there were some of these partially redistributive policies. So if you go before then to World War One, when soldiers came back, they just kind of gave them a bus ticket and they were like, "Thanks, we appreciate it." Whereas because you had this rise of communism in certain countries, and there were a lot of people sympathetic to it. They said we have to handle this better when soldiers come back, and so they did the GI Bill. They put them through college, they put them through technical schools, they helped them get homes, and they tax the wealthy at pretty high levels, while also, as we mentioned, inflating away their bonds, which were in large part held by the wealthy. And so you had that partially redistributed policy without going into like communism, right? So they said in order to not have communism, let's go like 20% of the way there and try to fix some of these imbalances, right? So that's kind of what they did. They kind of threaded that needle. Um, and so another way of looking at it is that when you have inflation, it benefits debtors over creditors. And so people often use the narrative that the problem is that the wealthy, they have all these inflation indexed assets, they have these hard assets, so they don't mind inflation, but that the poor and the middle class, they have most of their assets in cash, and that gets inflated away. But that's actually only partially, that's missing a big picture, because if you look at the data of the bottom 50%, and then you look at the next like 40%, the middle 50 to the 90, then you look at the next 9% and you look at the 1%. If you segment those four groups, as you go down the income spectrum, they have higher debt to asset ratios. So the bottom 50% have almost zero net worth because, they have roughly as much liabilities as assets. Then when you go up to the next group, the kind of the middle to upper middle class, they have more assets than liabilities, but still quite a bit of liabilities. They generally have a very large, say, fixed rate mortgage. They might have credit card debt. And as you go up, into the top 1%, they're actually very unlevered on average, unless they happen to be like a real estate mogul or something. Their entire net worth in real estate, they're highly leveraged. But other than like, specific examples, they are generally very unlevered. And so when you have that inflation, you know, those say people in those lower middle spectrums, sure, their cash balances don't do well, but their mortgage gets partially, inflated away, their credit card debt gets partially inflated away, different liabilities like that. And so it's actually, and also they generally benefit from those redistributive policies, whether it's the GI Bill or child tax credits and stimulus checks. It really depends on the specific environment. In this particular environment, so say the past 10 years, We've had, say, asset price inflation. We've had suppressed wages. We've outsourced labor. We've automated labor. And so this has been a wonderful environment for the top 1%, top 5%, top 10%. And it's been wealth concentration. And then even in here in 2020, 2021, when we did some of those, types of inflationary policies, we gave people stimulus checks, things like that. But if you look at the percentage of the money that went to that versus the entire spending, it's still actually a pretty small percentage, and a lot of it just flowed into corporations and asset prices still. And so that was one of those environments where kind of the top 1% did fantastic still. So it really kind of comes down to the nuances of how policy is constructed. And that's why it's one of those things. It doesn't make us a quick soundbite, right? So that's a really boring, long answer for is inflation good or bad for wealth concentration. I think that the ideal environment is you just have good policy and you don't have inflation and people have access to ways to protect their capital, like Bitcoin and whatever else.